You are sitting somewhere right now, maybe on a couch, maybe at a desk, and without you noticing, your lungs have already moved air in and out, roughly 12 to 16 times since you started reading this sentence. And every single one of those breaths is doing something so small and so fundamental that almost nobody ever stops to think about it, because the oxygen molecule that just entered your body is about to be split apart, torn down to the level of individual atoms, and used to build the actual energy currency that keeps every cell in your body alive. And in the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly what happens at that atomic level when you take 5 minutes and breathe deeply on purpose, not the vague wellness version of this idea, but the real biochemistry of it, the part where your body physically rearranges matter every time you inhale. And once you understand this, you will never look at a simple breath the same way again. Before we go further, if this kind of deep, mechanism-first explanation is something you enjoy, this is exactly what this channel is built around, so consider subscribing to Smart Psychology so you do not miss the next one. And now let us actually get into the atoms. Every atom of oxygen that enters your lungs during a breath travels through a genuinely remarkable path in a matter of seconds. It crosses through the thin membrane of your alveoli, those tiny grape-like sacs at the very end of your airways, and it binds to a molecule called hemoglobin inside your red blood cells. Hemoglobin is built around iron atoms, and it is specifically the iron atom at the center of each hemoglobin unit that oxygen physically attaches to, 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin protein, carried through your bloodstream to every tissue that needs it. This is not a metaphor. This is literal atomic chemistry happening inside you right now. Iron atoms grabbing oxygen atoms and ferrying them through roughly 60,000 miles of blood vessels in your body. Once that oxygen arrives at a cell, it does not just sit there being useful in some vague sense. It goes straight into the mitochondria, the structures inside almost every one of your cells that are often called the powerhouse of the cell for a reason. Inside the mitochondria, there is a process called the electron transport chain. And this is where things get genuinely strange and beautiful at the same time. Electrons that were pulled off the food you ate earlier are passed down a chain of proteins embedded in the mitochondrial membrane, like a bucket brigade moving something valuable from hand to hand. And at the very end of that chain, oxygen is waiting to accept those electrons. When oxygen finally accepts those electrons, along with hydrogen atoms, it is transformed into water, actual H2O, formed fresh inside your cells in that moment. Every single breath you take is, at the cellular level, partly about manufacturing water molecules out of oxygen atoms and hydrogen atoms and electrons that started as food. Researchers have estimated that the human body produces somewhere around 300 to 400 milliliters of this metabolic water every single day, entirely from this internal atomic process, without you drinking a drop of it. While that electron transport chain is running, something else is happening in parallel that is arguably even more important. A gradient of hydrogen atoms, specifically hydrogen ions, builds up across the mitochondrial membrane. This gradient is not just a side effect, it is the entire point. That buildup of hydrogen ions creates a kind of pressure, and your cells have evolved an almost unbelievable piece of molecular machinery to use that pressure, a rotating enzyme called ATP synthase. Hydrogen ions flow through this enzyme the way water flows through a turbine, and as they pass through, the enzyme physically spins, and that spinning motion mechanically forces phosphate groups onto a molecule called ADP, converting it into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the molecule that functions as the energy currency for essentially every process in your body: muscle contraction, thought, digestion, the beating of your own heart. This rotating enzyme has been measured at speeds of several hundred revolutions per second, and it exists in the trillions inside your body, and every single rotation is powered directly by the oxygen atoms you pulled in with your last breath. Now here is the part that connects all of this back to the simple act of breathing deeply for 5 minutes. Because how much oxygen actually reaches this whole system depends heavily on how you breathe, not just whether you breathe. Shallow chest breathing, the kind most adults default to when they are stressed, anxious, or simply sitting hunched over a screen, only ventilates the upper portion of the lungs. A large amount of the lower lung tissue, where blood flow is actually highest due to gravity, barely gets used. Deep diaphragmatic breathing changes this completely. When you engage the diaphragm fully, pulling it down and expanding the lower rib cage, You draw air into the lower lobes of the lungs where the blood supply is richest, which means more oxygen atoms are making contact with more hemoglobin, which means more electrons flowing down that transport chain, which means more ATP synthase turbines spinning, which means more usable energy for your cells. 5 minutes of genuinely deep, slow breathing measurably increases the efficiency of this entire chain, and it is not a small or symbolic increase, it is a real shift in how much oxygen your blood is actually carrying and delivering. There is also a second story happening here involving carbon dioxide, and most people get this part backwards. Carbon dioxide is often thought of as pure waste, something your body simply needs to get rid of, but the atoms of carbon and oxygen that make up CO2 play an active regulatory role before they ever leave your body. Carbon dioxide dissolved in your blood controls the pH of your blood plasma, and it also directly determines how easily oxygen releases from hemoglobin into your tissues, a relationship discovered over a century ago and known as the Bohr effect, named after the physiologist Christian Bohr. When you breathe too fast and too shallow, which is exactly what chronic low-grade stress does to most people throughout the day, you exhale too much carbon dioxide too quickly. This drives your blood pH slightly more alkaline, and paradoxically, this actually makes it harder for hemoglobin to release the oxygen it is carrying, even though your blood oxygen saturation reading might look completely normal on a pulse oximeter. Your tissues can be starved for usable oxygen, while your blood is technically full of it, purely because of a chemical imbalance in carbon dioxide atoms, and slow deep breathing directly corrects this by restoring a healthier carbon dioxide balance and allowing oxygen to actually release where it is needed. If you are finding this as fascinating as I do, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button on Smart Psychology, because we are about to go even deeper into what 5 minutes of this practice does to your nervous system and your longer-term cellular health, and you will want to see where this leads. Deep breathing does not stay contained to your lungs and your mitochondria. It reaches directly into your nervous system through a specific physical pathway, the vagus nerve. This is the longest cranial nerve in the human body, running from your brainstem down through your neck, chest, and abdomen, and it is the primary communication highway of your parasympathetic nervous system, the branch of your nervous system responsible for rest, digestion, and recovery. Slow, deep breathing, particularly breathing where the exhale is longer than the inhale, physically stimulates the vagus nerve through mechanical stretch receptors in the lungs and diaphragm. Dr. Stephen Porges, whose polyvagal theory has reshaped how scientists understand this nerve, has described how vagal stimulation through breathing shifts the entire body out of a sympathetic fight or flight state and into a calmer, more regulated physiological state within minutes. This is measurable, not theoretical, through something called heart rate variability, the tiny fluctuations in time between each heartbeat. And studies have consistently shown that slow breathing at around 6 breaths per minute produces some of the highest heart rate variability readings researchers have recorded, a strong marker of a healthy, adaptable nervous system. Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School spent decades studying what he termed the relaxation response, and his research found that structured breathing practices reliably lowered heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen consumption, and cortisol levels within a matter of minutes, essentially the physiological opposite of the stress response. What makes this especially relevant to the atomic story we started with is that cortisol itself interferes with mitochondrial function. Elevated cortisol has been shown in research to increase oxidative stress inside mitochondria and reduce the efficiency of that electron transport chain we talked about earlier. Meaning chronic stress does not just feel bad, it measurably disrupts the very atomic machinery that generates your cellular energy. 5 minutes of deep breathing lowers cortisol quickly enough to interrupt this disruption before it compounds, which is part of why people so often describe feeling immediately clearer and calmer after even a short session. There is another layer to this involving a molecule called nitric oxide, and this part of the story earned an actual Nobel Prize. In 1998, Robert Furchgott, Louis Ignarro, and Ferid Murad were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for discovering the role of nitric oxide as a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. Nitric oxide is produced in your nasal passages and paranasal sinus, and slow nasal breathing, especially with a longer exhale, has been shown in research to significantly increase nitric oxide uptake into the lungs compared to mouth breathing. Nitric oxide relaxes and widens blood vessels, improving blood flow and, once again, improving how efficiently oxygen atoms are delivered to your tissues. Breathing slowly through your nose for 5 minutes is not just a calming ritual, it is a direct chemical pathway to better oxygen delivery throughout your entire circulatory system. At this point, it is worth pausing to genuinely appreciate the scale of what is happening. You have iron atoms in your blood capturing oxygen atoms, electrons stripped from your last meal, traveling down a molecular chain inside structures smaller than a speck of dust. A rotating enzyme spinning hundreds of times per second to physically construct your body's energy currency, carbon and oxygen atoms regulating your blood chemistry, and a single nerve reaching from your brainstem to your gut adjusting your entire physiological state. And every part of this system responds, in real time, to something as simple as how slowly and how deeply you choose to breathe for the next 300 seconds. Before we go further into the longer-term effects, if you want more breakdowns like this, ones that take something you do every day without thinking and show you the actual science underneath it, Smart Psychology is built exactly for that. So subscribing means you will not miss what comes next, and there is more worth knowing. Now let us talk about what happens with consistent practice over time, because 5 minutes is not just a momentary event, it appears to compound. Chronic psychological stress has been linked in multiple studies to shorter telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of your chromosomes that shorten slightly with each cell division and are strongly associated with cellular aging. Elizabeth Blackburn, who won a Nobel Prize for work on telomeres and the enzyme telomerase, and her collaborator Elissa Pell, published research showing that people under chronic stress had measurably shorter telomeres compared to less stressed individuals of the same age, and their later work found that mind-body practices including slow controlled breathing were associated with higher telomerase activity, the enzyme that helps rebuild and maintain those protective caps. The proposed mechanism runs directly through the stress response. Lower cortisol and lower sympathetic activation appear to reduce the oxidative and inflammatory burden that erodes telomeres over time, which means the atomic level efficiency you get from a single 5-minute breathing session, repeated consistently, may be connected to how well your cells maintain their genetic material over years and decades. There is also compelling research from Radboud University in the Netherlands involving Wim Hof, a breathing practitioner, whose method combines cycles of deep breathing with breath holds. In a controlled study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, researchers led by Mathieu Cox injected participants with a bacterial endotoxin that normally produces flu-like symptoms, and the group trained in this breathing method showed significantly reduced inflammatory markers and reported milder symptoms compared to a control group, along with elevated levels of adrenaline that appeared to directly suppress the innate immune response. This was one of the first controlled demonstrations that voluntary breathing techniques could measurably alter immune function, something scientists had long assumed was entirely outside conscious control. The mechanism traced back, again, to the same core pathway: breathing pattern altering nervous system activity altering hormone release altering how cells throughout the body, including immune cells, actually behave at a molecular level. Military and high-performance communities have arrived at similar conclusions through entirely practical means, rather than laboratory research. Navy SEALs are trained in a technique often called box breathing, inhaling for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4 seconds, and holding again for 4 seconds, specifically because it reliably brings an activated nervous system back into a controlled state within minutes during high-stress situations. The underlying physiology is the same story told from a different angle. Controlled deep breathing recruits the vagus nerve, increases heart rate variability, and shifts the body away from the kind of sympathetic dominance that impairs clear thinking and fine motor control under pressure. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth understanding before we bring it all together, and it involves your brain specifically. Because your brain is the single most oxygen-hungry organ in your entire body, consuming somewhere around 20% of your total oxygen intake, despite making up only about 2% of your body weight. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, focus, decision-making, and impulse control, is especially sensitive to small fluctuations in oxygen delivery and blood chemistry. And this is part of why shallow, rapid breathing during stress so often coincides with foggy thinking, difficulty concentrating, and impulsive reactions you later regret. When carbon dioxide is exhaled too quickly through shallow breathing, the resulting shift in blood pH can actually cause blood vessels in the brain to constrict slightly, a phenomenon linked to symptoms like lightheadedness and mental fog that many people experience during anxious moments without ever connecting it back to their breathing pattern. Slow, deep breathing reverses this constriction, restoring healthier blood flow to the exact brain regions you need most when you are trying to think clearly under pressure. Researchers studying breathwork and cognition, including work coming out of laboratory, studying attention and interoception, have found that structured slow breathing sessions as short as a few minutes can measurably improve sustained attention and reduce the physiological markers associated with anxiety, and pilots, surgeons, and elite athletes have independently adopted breathing techniques for exactly this reason, not because it feels nice, but because it produces a measurable performance edge when clear thinking under pressure matters most. It is also worth acknowledging why so many of us have drifted away from this kind of breathing in the first place, because this is not really a personal failing, it is largely environmental. Long hours spent hunched forward over phones and laptops physically compress the chest and abdomen, restricting the diaphragm's ability to move fully, and a near-constant low-level state of alertness from notifications, deadlines, and background stress keeps the sympathetic nervous system slightly activated for most of the day, which naturally produces faster, shallower breathing as a default pattern. Over years, this becomes the body's baseline, and most people never consciously notice it happening because it develops so gradually. This is exactly why a deliberate 5-minute session matters so much, because it is not competing against nothing, it is actively counteracting a pattern that modern daily life quietly reinforces hour after hour, which means the benefit you get from those 5 minutes is often larger than it would have been for someone living a slower, less screen-dominated life a century ago. Pulling all of this together into something you can actually use, here is what 5 minutes of genuine deep breathing does, moving from the smallest scale to largest. At the atomic level, it increases how efficiently oxygen atoms bind to iron in your hemoglobin and travel through your electron transport chain, generating more ATP and more metabolic water inside your mitochondria. At the chemical level, it rebalances carbon dioxide in your blood so that oxygen actually releases into your tissues rather than staying locked to hemoglobin, and it boosts nitric oxide production, widening blood vessels, and improving circulation throughout your body. At the nervous system level, it stimulates the vagus nerve, raises heart rate variability, and triggers the relaxation response, lowering cortisol and reducing the oxidative stress that cortisol places on your mitochondria. And at the longest time scale, consistent practice appears to be associated with better maintained telomeres, reduced systemic inflammation, and a nervous system that recovers from stress more efficiently over months and years. If you want to actually try this rather than just understand it, the practical version is simple. Sit upright somewhere quiet, breathe in slowly through your nose for around 4 to 5 seconds, feeling your lower belly expand rather than just your chest. Hold gently for a second or two, then exhale slowly through your nose or mouth for 6 to 8 seconds, making the exhale noticeably longer than the inhale, since a longer exhale is what most strongly engages the vagus nerve. Repeat this for 5 minutes. You do not need an app, a mat, or any special environment. You need 5 minutes and a basic understanding of what you are actually doing to your body while you do it, which is precisely what you now have. This applies whether you are 22 and dealing with the pressure of a first job, 45 and juggling a career and a family, or 60 and managing the slower recovery that comes with age, because the underlying atomic and chemical machinery we have been describing does not change across that entire range. Only the pace of daily stress that pushes people away from using it well. A college student cramming before an exam, a parent trying to stay calm during a chaotic morning, and a retiree managing blood pressure are all, at the level of biochemistry, dealing with the exact same electron transport chain, the exact same vagus nerve, and the exact same carbon dioxide balance, which means this single 5-minute practice genuinely scales across almost every stage of adult life without needing to be modified. Before you go, if today's explanation gave you a new way of seeing something as automatic as breathing, That is exactly the kind of shift this channel is built to create, and subscribing to Smart Psychology means the next one lands in front of you the moment it is ready. So consider joining, and consider taking 5 minutes today, right after this, to actually put this into practice. What is genuinely remarkable when you step back from all of it is that none of this required you to buy anything, take anything, or change anything about your life except the pace and depth of something you were already doing roughly 20,000 times a day without a second thought. Every one of those breaths has always been rearranging atoms inside you, building water molecules, spinning molecular turbines, shuttling electrons down a microscopic chain, and the only real difference between an ordinary breath and a genuinely useful one is intention and depth. 5 minutes is a small amount of time to trade for a body that is, quite literally, running better chemistry, and now that you understand the mechanism instead of just the advice, that 5 minutes probably feels a lot more worth taking.